Well, good afternoon. Yeah. So, as far as continuity, throw it out the window, right? There's no continuity because we just had of course, the fall feasts, right? And I think one rabbi said, can you maybe not put them all in one month, but that's the way it is. And just a couple of fun things first, before, and we want to do a little bit of review, very little, because we really, last time we were together, we finished the call of Abraham, if you recall, and we wanted to move on to the Mosaic Revelation. And by the way, the Mosaic Revelation, it's an amazing thing because it's the whole Revelation itself is couched in this idea of kindness to the alien, kindness to the stranger, to the disenfranchised. And so Israel is birthed out of this matrix of really knowing experientially the importance of being gracious and kind to those who are less fortunate, those who are without. And of course, as you remember, one of the three sins, great sins of Israel that resulted in the captivities, was injustice, right? The prophets speak regularly about Israel being unjust and not showing kindness to the stranger. So we want to look at that. But first, I just thought this might be kind of fun. This is, if you look at this, the D stands for doing, and the L stands for living. And so these particular practices are divided. The rabbis divide them up. Some are doing, some are living. They tell you that the doing is really important, and it's important in the context of what I'm saying. And I'm talking about transmitting. I'm talking within Jewish space. You have to understand the importance of ensuring a very coherent Judaism to the next generation. What is important and what is not important? What is essential? In other words, in terms of their importance of ensuing that a vital, coherent Judaism is transmitted to the next generation, right? You might want to rate the following this way. So it's really, there's no real right or wrong, but I just thought it would be kind of interesting to think about this. Observe kashrut, laws of kashrut, keeping kosher, right? Taking part in the Seder, supporting Israel, don't work on the feasts and festivals, keeping Shabbat, belief in God, daily prayer, and of course we're talking about a scripted prayer, Amidah, Shemona Esrei. Have mostly Jewish friends. That'll kind of segue into my next one I want to show you. Light Hanukkah candles. Repent at the high holy days. Make Havdalah, very important. By the way, Havdalah, this concept of separation, goes all the way back to the very first chapter and very few verses of Genesis where God separates, right? He engages in separation. So key to order. We were talking in July, if you don't want chaos in the society, you have to maintain these separations. And that's why I said we are coming into a very dangerous time when the distinction between male and female is sought to being erased. And if that really progresses the way it looks like it is, you're looking at absolute chaos. Because God instructed us way back in Bereshit that order is connected to separation. You can't so God takes something very chaotic and he begins to separate, land from sea, light from darkness, Israel from the nations. So separation is something that God sees as very important to keeping a society intact. And so we're moving very quickly, rapidly down this horrible path in our culture. Make Havdalah, no Jewish history, marry within the Jewish people, build a sukkah, right?
What's a sukkah?
That's a singular for Sukkot, when we build a little hut, little flimsy structure, when we do it every fall, it kind of wraps up the fall feast. Practice Jewish sexual values. There are some stipulations for that. Give tzedakah, lead an ethical life, and belong to a synagogue. Now, all I want to just have some fun with this, if you want to just maybe take a guess, because even though there's no technically right or wrong, I think there are some that seem to be more just by observation. When Jews go astray and they come back in the fold, and we're not talking about Messianic or non-Messianic, we're just talking about just Judaism as a whole. Well, a lot of secular Jews go off, and sometimes they come back to the fold. And how is it that they enter? What is it that kind of which ones of these are most important for transmitting, to future generations their Jewish heritage? So I don't know if you can just maybe pick one or two or three that you think might be important. At least it shows statistically that Jews come back into the fold through these observations. Yeah, if Sam.
I was just going to make a joke. I was going to say, when you have mostly Jewish friends, when you're in a Messianic congregation, that can mean something different. It means that somebody like their level Jewish, they're mostly Jewish. So that's my personal joke.
Yeah.
When people tell you like my great grandfather was Jewish. So
what's that? Yeah, I think Jim Mercantanti has this thing where like Jewish people never leave and Gentiles, I don't know how it works or something. But anyway, okay, so that's good. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
I think making that separated the Jewish people from the rest of the world was their belief in God.
Okay, so belief in God, that's coming. Okay, any others? Okay, well, let me just say this, that I took this survey, and the most popular answers, and I always joke around the most popular wrong answer, right? But the most popular answer was actually keeping Shabbat. Jews who kind of go astray a bit from their heritage, from the growing up, and when they come back, the statistics show that they start keeping Shabbat. Now they might not do it to the degree that we think is right or wrong, but just even if they just light the candles or something, that is something that is very meaningful. And so the next one on the list was actually a Seder. A lot of Jews and Jewish people who kind of trash their heritage, take up some Eastern mysticism, and that was very popular. And by the way, that's here to stay. There's a mixture today of humanism and Eastern mysticism today, which is growing. But Jews who come back attend Seder again. They attend their a first Seder, maybe with friends. They come back into the fold that way. And finally, the last one actually was Hanukkah. Hanukkah is kind of a fun kind of thing. Anyway, not that these are right or wrong, but these were the answers that we got the most in this survey. So I just thought it was kind of interesting. And that kind of leads to this. This is kind of funny too. So I thought this might be worth kind of you've heard of the 10 Commandments, right? These are the 10 Jewish questions, right? So I like to joke around. This is actually part of a class we had done for a few semesters somewhere. And whenever we're talking about things Jewish, I always ask like what prompted you to take a course on things Jewish or Jewish things or Messianic Jewish foundations, and they have a ton of answers. So sometimes I just present this as kind of a very lighthearted way to begin, thinking about, do you have any Jewish friends? Grew up in your neighborhood, coworkers. But the 10 questions. Why are so many Jews highly educated? And a lot of these, by the way, yes.
With more ability than other groups.
Well, we could say that on a maybe corporate level. There's a supernatural gifting, but it rests corporately, and we have to be very careful that we're not talking about individual Jews, but we're talking collectively. Yes, there's a supernatural gifting upon the Jewish people to actually confirm the covenant. To be a blessing to the world through evangelism, yet that blessing now has gone out in many directions in the sciences and the arts, and that's been a blessing to the world. But those areas, they're good areas. But the covenant, it's basically to to live out that covenant and be a blessing. But why are so many Jews highly educated? And let me say, a lot of these have very historic reasons. Education is, in some sense, it's power. I mean, knowing things is a type of power, and the Jews have suffered horribly throughout the centuries. And this is a way of saying never again. This is a way of saying, look, we're gonna. And so, right, I remember like growing up in my family, my extended family. This was a big deal. I mean, this was, a lot of times you see like little Jewish kids are inside studying when other kids are out playing. Not that that's can't like overlap, but why do Jews tend to be successful in business? Good negotiators, right? Where does that come from? And a lot of this stuff really goes back to the Middle Ages, when Jewish people were targeted and they were forced into these debates, and with some high clergy, with parts of the church that were not very, the church was engaging in some very negative things. But Jews would find themselves in these predicaments, and they would, if they lost these debates, they would be forced to convert, and if they won the debate, they could potentially even be killed. Ooh. So you've got these historic reasons. Why do Jews tend to be good with money? Well, that's another interesting thing, whether that's true or not. And we're not talking individually, collectively, whether you agree with that or not, but. Jewish people were forced into money lending years and years ago because this was a sinful practice. Usury, interest, and the church didn't want to have their hands dirty, so that they gave it to the Jews, and consequently, the Jews got pretty good at that kind of thing. Why are Jews viewed as sometimes being stingy or non-generous? I don't think that's true. My dad was probably the best tipper I ever saw. Well, and this is part tzedakah. This is part of Judaism, tzedakah, to give, to be philanthropist. And my father, I remember, he was very, very generous philanthropist, extremely generous, an extremely generous tipper, like at a restaurant. So, why are Jews often tough negotiators? Well, that goes back to some of those debates, right? Why are Jews often aggressive and argumentative? We always have these funny things in marriage counseling where, a Gentile girl marries a Jewish guy, and they complain to the pastor, why is he always so argumentative? It's like, this one thing. Anyway, one good thing of this, we can argue with God. God lets us argue with him, right? And he doesn't smite us, right? Why do most Jews have good families? In other words, why is the family structure so strong? And that's that cohesive element that's important for the survival of a Jewish people. Why are the closest friends of Jews other Jews? Well, why do Jews tend to, well, there's things in common, and things of persecution. Why do Jews tend to be so resistant to the gospel? Well, that's a whole, if you study church history from a Jewish perspective, that's part of it. It's not all of it. Because remember, the Jewish rejection of Yeshua came before the times of the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the pogroms, right? So there's more to it than that. But since then, at least, you could say part of it is church history. Why do Jews tend to be politically liberal? Well, the truth is Jewish people, historically, Jews have suffered more when the church was kind of meshed with the state. You could say that under right wing, and they did better when the secular world was kind of more in power. So there's this kind of in the Jewish conscience. It's almost like Jews, even though they tend to be shooting themselves in the foot by voting a certain way, they will maintain it because there's this. In the Jewish consciousness, there's still this residual of not trusting the right, of not trusting the church or clergy, and that was all mess. So anyway, I don't know if you thought that was a waste of time, probably. No. Okay, so, but anyway, I'm trying to move on here. It's been a long time So, if you recall, we started with Torah foundations, and we were saying that in Judaism, not you don't see this in Christian circles, but in Judaism, we venerate the Torah, right? Now, and when we say the Torah, of course, that word means a lot of things, but we're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible, right? And so built upon that is the Nevi'im, the prophets, and that we like a lot. We like acronyms, so Tanakh is an acronym: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. But built upon the Torah are the prophets. Built upon that are the writings, and of course, from our perspective, built upon that are the New Covenant scriptures, the Gospels, the letters. So Jewish tradition is a little different. They venerate the Torah. The first 5 books is key, right? And upon that, everything else is built, and upon that, everything else kind of hangs, if you remember. And so Torah is foundational, right? It's not that the synagogue depreciates the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. They don't, but they have this very strong sense of it being very foundational and very important. So, and of course, this has implications for us, right? Our understanding of the New Testament, because any interpretation of the New Covenant scriptures that is, which is inconsistent, or actually changes the meaning or reinterprets it totally, cannot be the right interpretation. It's got to be built on, so truth builds upon truth, right? It's very important. And so, yes, there can be nuance, there can be light shed, but we're not talking about changing essentially what came before. And so we talked a little bit about that, if you recall. And then we moved on to the call of Abraham. If you have any comments or questions, just speak out, raise your hand. We said Jewish history begins with the call of Abraham, right? Although the term Jew, we could say, really derives from the word Judah. I mean, it has to do with one whose destiny is to be a praiser or a worshiper. That's what Yehuda or Jew means, to be a worshiper or to be a praiser. It's interesting in Romans 2, Paul talks about this verse. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And so Paul is not making a statement about humans in general there, and this is very, very controversial, at least in Christian circles. He's not making a statement about humans in general, saying that all humans are Jewish if they are circumcised in their heart. That's not what Paul is saying. We have to put chapter 2 of Romans in context. What is Paul talking about? He's talking about both Gentiles and Jews having sinned and guilty before God, are indicted before God and need redemption, right? So just like Gentiles, Jews enter into the fullness of their calling and have this inner heart transformation. But the physical is not enough, Paul is saying. They have to not only be circumcised physically, be Jewish, but they also have this heart circumcision. So that's very key. That's very key. Paul is saying that to reach your destiny as a Jew, and what all that word means, as you must also, along with being Jewish, physical circumcision, you must have this circumcision of heart, or you will never reach your destiny as a true praiser and a true worshiper. That's all Paul is saying. But the Jewish history begins with the call of Abraham, although the term Jew was derived somewhat later. However, God's covenant with Israel begins with Abraham. So in a very loose sense, we could say that Abraham was the first Jew. Let's put it that way. Abraham recognizes the voice of God very back in Sumar, back in Mesopotamia, where the scholars and historians tell us today that it was steeped in reincarnation. You are determined by your fate. It was the culture of the great wheel. Que sera, sera. Everything was determined. Everything was. Abraham kind of breaks out of that cyclical or cyclical kind of entrapment, and he goes on a journey, and he gives to the world the gift of linear time. In a sense, he gives to the world this concept that we are really going somewhere in our lives, and what we did yesterday really does affect our todays and tomorrows. And of course, we're moving toward the second coming. But Abraham breaks out of this culture of the great wheel. And I'm sure there was ridicule. And, this is real stuff, folks. I mean, he lived in a real place with real people and real society. And I'm sure he was mocked for that. But he listens to the voice of God, and he goes on this journey. And of course, this is reaffirmed. God promises three things, to Abraham. And those three things he promises him. He says in Genesis 12. Okay. Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. By the way, you can't be a great nation if you're a wicked people. Okay? God doesn't assumes righteousness when he says, I'm going to make you, and he assumes even more, he assumes salvation. Okay? He assumes that I'm going to make you a great wicked nation. No, righteousness is married to this, right? God is going to make, I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. There's just think of this huge word. It is the word controversy. God right here tells us that there will be controversy, that there will people who will be supportive of this and seek to enter into God's plan through blessing Abraham and his offspring, and there will people who will not do that, and they will actually offer resistance. So right from the start, if just the whole idea of election is controversial, God chooses over here, and he does not choose from over here. And we're not going to get into election, but I want you to start to think of election not so much in terms of heaven and hell, but in terms of God choosing. God chooses the one that is flawed. He doesn't choose Ishmael, he chooses Isaac. Isaac is deeply flawed. So the only way that Isaac can enter into his election and enter into the fullness of his destiny is through supernatural gifting and calling. So the whole idea of election is controversial, and it's how we respond to those. If we get close to, if Ishmael got close to Isaac, he could receive that blessing in his own right. If he resists Isaac and he persecutes Isaac, he won't enter into that blessing. And God is going to do some great things in the earth with election. Election tells God, and God has to know, right? Tells God where we are. It's a barometer of where our hearts are, how we respond. Because remember, if you look all through history, God chooses Joseph. He's the elect one, right? His brothers, instead of resisting him and persecuting, could have gotten close to him and received the blessing in their own right. If you jump over to Matthew 27, the Jewish leaders were jealous of Yeshua, of Jesus, right? They knew who he was. They brought in the rental crowd, right? To say all those things. They knew who he was. They could have gotten close and received that blessing, but they resisted and they persecuted him. And I think the same in the last days, because it's going to get closer and closer. And Israel is an elect people. In their unbelief, they are an elect people. And the irony, and this is, I think, what caused Paul so much grief and anguish, is because you can be an elect as a people group, and yet for 2,000 years, individual Jews are dying. They're resisting God, and they're forever separated from the Lord. So that caused Paul a great deal of anguish. You can be an elect as a people group, and yet individual people within that group can be lost. Okay, so election is a big thing. But just to look at this call, so go out from your country. So he's to elect. So this is the first part of the blessing. There's land, there's greatness, which equals righteousness, right? God is not into a wicked great nation, right? And then there's so two are for Israel, and one is for the nations. This blessing will be promised to the nations. Okay, so we looked at that. We looked at how Abraham broke out of this great wheel, and he goes on this journey. And what exactly did Abraham believe? By the way, Abraham's faith is really the basis for the gospel in the New Testament. Paul makes that very clear in Romans chapter 4, right? This is the kind of faith that is the model for walking out New Testament, New Covenant righteousness and faith. It's what is the kind of faith that pleases God? It's the kind of faith that Abraham had. What did Abraham believe? We talked about that. So Abraham believes, first of all, Abraham's faith was sufficient enough for him to travel on with God, and his faith was sufficient enough to believe that God was going to give him a posterity. Those two things. And we were saying that the last one is very important, that God is going to give him a posterity when he's old, and physically speaking, it would be impossible to him. So Abraham, the kind of faith that Abraham had, which is the kind of faith we have to mimic, is the kind of faith that sees things that are not as though they are. It's the kind of faith that sees that calls things that do not exist as if they do exist. That's the kind of faith you want to walk in. And said Abraham walked in that kind of faith, and he didn't waver. He didn't. The idea is he didn't waver between two opinions. And I believe he practiced faith confession. I believe he spoke those promises out loudly. Of course, we know in his name, his very name is a testimony to God being faithful to the covenant, father of a multitude. So if Abraham had the name change before he actually saw the physical reality of that promise. So that's the faith that God values. That's the faith that, because Paul uses Abraham as a model for us today. So we did talk about that. Circumcision, Abraham circumcises Abraham. I know Sam talked a little about that today. Circumcision is a sign of the covenant. We have lots of signs and symbols. In Judaism is rich with signs and symbols, right? We've got mezuzot, we've got tefillin, we've got a lot of these different things. But circumcision is a sign of response to God. In other words, Abraham believed God, it says, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So his trust was in God. What did Abraham believe? As we said, it's probably unlikely that he believed that some Jewish guy was going to come later down the road and die on this Roman crucifix stake kind of thing. That's probably not what he believed. But Abraham's faith and our faith is a parallel faith, right? Because if Abraham's faith is calling that which is dead back to life, think about our whole salvation experience. We were dead in trespasses and sins. God breathes life into us, right? And we're alive to God. So we have this parallel faith to Abraham. It's not a foreign faith. Abraham and us have this parallel. We're in the kind of faith that we have. And Abraham exercised that faith, and we exercise that faith. But circumcision was a sign of response to the covenant. It wasn't the act that made Abraham righteous. The same can be said about New Covenant mikvah, or baptism, right, or immersion, right? It's a symbol of what has actually taken place on the inside. There was a real death in the spirit. We died to that Adamic nature. And I say it was no less real than God bringing life into Sarah's womb physically, right? We died to that, and we were and we were raised up in new life in the spirit it was very real. A real act has taken place in the spirit, right? So that's another thing we get from Abraham. Circumcision, clearly shows that it was always God's intention for this covenant to be carried on through Abraham's spiritual seed, right? No, his physical seed, right? The term, well, I'm a spiritual Jew. Well, that terminology is not very helpful today. But circumcision in the flesh, in the male reproductive organ, God does it to show, to demonstrate that the covenant is clearly carried on through Abraham's physical descendants, right? In Maimonides' 13 articles or principles of faith, I think number 2 or 3 says God is not corporeal. God is not physical. Well, I don't know. It's not true. Even in today's parasha, right? We have an appearance, a messiaophany or a theophany, however you want to phrase it. God comes in form, in human form, right? Something Judaism can't seem to accept or embrace. But the point is that God is clearly showing that this covenant was meant to be carried on through Abraham's physical descendants, right? And I think we read from Abraham's promise with Michael Wishigrod, and we were saying some things about very powerful defense about the covenant being passed on through Abraham's physical seed. It would seem to us that the covenant should be carried on through this spiritually, through morality, but that's not. Most of the world would fail in that. God enters into a concrete relationship and covenant with Abraham and his seed. And when I say concrete, it's yet you combine agape with eros. God chooses him. He enters into a full relationship and covenant with Abraham in all of his physicality and his spirituality, both. And that becomes the kind of like the kind of mirror of what God wants to do with all peoples, right? So the covenant is carried on through Abraham's physical seed, not through Abraham's spiritual seed. And this, of course, brings us up to the new covenant when we read from Paul says, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies. The Jews, they're enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's gracious choice, his election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and calling of God is irrevocable. So God enters into this unilateral, unconditional covenant with Abraham's physical seed and will ultimately see that they reach their destiny as a people group. And he will, and he is, and more and more. So I think that kind of brings us full circle to where we were. And so I want any comments at this point or things let me just show you this thing really quick here. This is not in order if we did it in the class, but like I just want to show you this here. This is an interesting little these frescoes and statues that are throughout Europe. This one is entitled Ecclesia and Synagoga. The original Ecclesia and Synagoga from the portal of Strasbourg Cathedral, now in the museum and replaced by replicas. So I guess they deteriorated, but you can see this is like a picture of replacement theology. Like in other words, you can see, first of all, look at this. This is synagogue. This is the synagogue. This is Judaism here, and this is Christianity or Catholicism. Right? Now look at the statue. They're both of these women, and they have you can see that she's looking down. She's cast down, right? Her eyes and her head, and it looks like she has some kind of broken chalice. This is a symbol, at least they tell, of the Torah, of the Hebrew, and it's kind of cast down, and you can see this is just a symbol of how God has forsaken, wiped his hands of Israel, and now he's working with the church, right? course, that's not true. I mean, but a lot of the church is at that place. At that place. And then on the left here we have
Some pastors preach as you plus the Jewish people would be blessed.
right. I understand. That's true. Oh yeah. Did you have?
The reason why I left my last was when they had a horrible massacre at the tree.
Okay.
The response of mom, the bishop and the priest and those in leadership knew what happened and also how they treat the Jews. And I was so blind to that.
Right.
That they said that the Jews are our cousins. I had such a strong reaction to that. I said, how naive I was. I said, how can you say that? We're our brothers and sisters.
Okay.
Which led me to where I am.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
in seeing how anti-Semitic that theology is,
Yeah.
and anti-Christ, I had a very strong reaction.
Yeah.
And so I had a calling through the ministry, which led a spiritual journey to where I am now. And maybe this will help others, maybe not, but help my identity change.
Yeah.
That I see myself, I am not Jewish. I come from a very strong Scottish background,
Mm-hmm.
where my family, they fought in the Revolutionary War. We go way back. And so my DNA, if you will, inclinations, whatever, or my association, identity wrapped in that. But with me embracing and worshiping the God of Israel and recognizing that Christ came as a Jew, what has happened, I've been blessed with this richness. I will never be a Jew. Just, at 73,
Mm-hmm.
I'll never be a Jew. However, I am, when people ask me what's your denomination, which is I don't have one, but I see myself as a completed Messianic Gentile,
Mm-hmm.
which is more than just a Christian in my mind. It's specific. And identifies who I am.
Yeah, and
And
God doesn't want you to
love
become
God of Israel and that richness
Right.
that I'm receiving.
Right. Well, that's good. God doesn't want you to become a Jew. I think I can't find it right now, but Paul talks about like this idea of walking out the calling that you were given. But let me just I think a lot of churches are in a good place with this. But my thing is that I went to a dispensational Bible college, and what's happening today, and I really think this is true, is dispensationalism as a theological system is fading and it's eroding away. Now, why is that not good? Well, not dispensationalism is an entire system of eschatology and a lot of things, and a lot of that stuff is just not good, not, I don't think, accurate. But why is it not good that dispensationalism, which has really grabbed hold of Americans, like either through the Scofield Bible, like the Ryrie Study Bible, the idea of this, God, all the ages and all these pictorial things of the end times. It's the fact that it's fading today is not good, because even though it wasn't, you could say, scriptural in certain ways, it provided a system of support, a theological system of support for the Jewish people. Those who were from a dispensational school understood, looked at the scriptures and had what I think is a correct hermeneutic. They had a right approach to the scriptures, to interpret the scriptures straightforwardly. So they didn't read the church back into the the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And so that provided a system of support. God was going to be faithful to Israel, though they didn't see they didn't see what we think of as the one new man. They didn't see this partnership and cooperation between Jew and Gentile today. They actually, when a Jewish person becomes a Christian in dispensationalism, they actually become kind of a new race that you shed all ethnic barriers. I had some dispensational friends here in Monroeville years ago, and they thought it was wrong that I was leading or attending a Messianic Jewish congregation. That was for another time. That's not for now. Okay, but the point is that with the erosion of dispensationalism, you're going to have an erosion of support for Israel, and the ability to see the text, read the text straightforwardly, and see that God is not through with Israel. God means what He says. He's going to have a future, glorious future for Israel, because they're not spiritualizing the text. They're not applying it to the church. So with the erosion of that, you're going to have a very difficult end times, I think, because if much of the church thinks that they are Israel, how is it that they are going to be supportive of Israel when Israel goes off kilter? And they will. Our faithfulness to Israel and the state is not because they're a virtuous people or a democratic people in the Middle East. It's none of that stuff, because all that stuff is not going to hold up. Our faithfulness is based on is a covenant faithfulness. God made a covenant with these people, and it's a unilateral, unconditional covenant. And even if they fall below, even if they fall far below what they ought to be, God is absolutely committed to them. And as you see, as things begin to wind up and get closer and closer to the end times, Israel is going to be vilified. And without having a covenant basis of support for Israel, having it based on their virtues, that's just not going to be strong enough to hold up. If you think that you're Israel, how are you going to be in the place to support these people, when things really start to get heavy duty? And it will. So I'm just saying, I know we got to kind of get off that, but the point is that, look, so this is synagogue. This is a picture, a symbol of how the church is triumphant, right? We another name for covenant theology is triumphalism, or supersessionism. The church is triumphant, or the church. I'm saying the church on this side. This is the Jewish side. The church supersedes and triumphs over Israel, who broke God's law, who was disobedient, and God just wiped His hands of that and started working. Look at her. She's wearing a crown. She's upright. She has a chalice in her hand. Symbol of covenant, and she had or a chalice here and a cup, and there's a very sense of being upright and triumphant, right? And this is just like one of many of these frescoes and artifacts that you find that really symbolizes replacement theology and the fact that the church now is triumphant. I went to a men's retreat the other day. Just give me 1 second. Just 1 second. And they were talking about the Hebrew word chesed, right? Faithfulness, covenant loyalty. And he went through this whole litany and gave all these references. At the very end, I said, can I just present what I think is a glaring anomaly? And that was, if this is all true, if God is really into covenant faithfulness, a unilateral, unconditional, then why is it that most of the church today embraces a replacement theology? And he said, you're right. So, okay, go ahead.
I was just ask, do you think that they're putting it up there, on purpose, for, people to, I don't know, for, another agenda? Is that what you mean?
I think...
Rather than putting it up there like that?
I don't think it's on purpose. I think it's inculcated. I think it's just a reflection of church doctrine today. Church, in other words, the church as a whole taking a stand that we are the new Israel. God is finished. And God, by the way, in covenant theology, God never really had Israel in mind. They were like a shadowy people. He was always looking toward that end, that the covenant would now be changed and moved, or the covenant would be redefined. The interesting thing about the New Testament is the New Testament was written primarily for a few reasons, one of which is, of course, to deal with the revelation of Yeshua, but also to deal with this unbelievable transition now. And that's why the letters really deal with Gentile and Jewish relationships a lot, because this amazing transition where Gentiles are now come into covenant relationship without first having to become Jewish. That was revolutionary. Revolutionary. They didn't see that one coming, okay? That was part of the mystery, right, of this one new man kind of thing. So it was written for those reasons. It wasn't written to redefine Israel theologically. That's not why the New Testament was written. It says that's why it has very little to say about that. It's assumed what the force and the focus of the New Testament is primarily, at least from my understanding, is to deal with this transition and to deal with Jewish and Jewish Gentile relationships and getting along together now. Okay, so that's that, and we're just kind of going to move into the Mosaic revelation a little bit. Is there any everything okay with that? Or okay, so I'm just going to touch on that and then go a little longer, and we won't go too much longer. I know it's 2:30, so we started about 1:30 something, so maybe just a little over that. I just want to touch on the Mosaic revelation. So let's move on. We talked about the call of Abraham. God chooses an individual, and out of this individual comes a nation, right? Now, and that's why Abraham's faith is parallel to our faith, because Abraham believed that God was able to do this. He had a faith that called what was dead alive, basically. And we do that too, right? So God takes Yeshua, he's dead, he brings him back to life, he brings us when we were dead spiritually. He breathed life into us. So we're us and Abraham can hang out a little bit, right? We have stuff in common here, right? But they die. So we talk about the history of Jacob and the 12 patriarchs. They go into Egypt and they find themselves now in bondage to this king who doesn't know. A new king arises in Egypt. He doesn't know Joseph and his family. And so now, that we have this story of this horrible, grievous slavery, right, of the Jewish people in Egypt. And this really now, this slavery, this incubator of just harsh treatment now becomes the background for the entire Mosaic revelation. And that's just one of the last points. And by the way, this covenant that God makes, when we talk about the Mosaic revelation or the Mosaic covenant, it doesn't do away with the earlier Abrahamic covenant, right? Paul makes that very clear. That which comes after cannot nullify that which came before. And it also speaks to our graph of the Torah and the prophets and the writings, because what comes later can't change what came before. God made a unilateral unconditional covenant with Abraham. And if you think it's not true, you even see it in the text, because God reconfirms the covenant to Isaac and Jacob, and he reconfirms it to Jacob after that horrible display with his brother Esau, right? So if Jacob had any doubt that maybe God nullified the covenant because of his behavior, God reaffirms the covenant to Jacob. So that covenant, but anyway, so the Abrahamic covenant is an earlier foundational covenant. It doesn't alter or do away the fact that God enters into a covenant. We call it the Mosaic covenant or the Mosaic revelation. It doesn't alter the earlier covenant, right? And this, by the way, this covenant we want to see as we go later in this course is not what we've been told. Like this is the fact that how dispensationalism has really influenced so many believers and Christians. We see the Old Testament as of law and this grace, and we've got to get away from that kind of false dichotomy of law. I want you to paint through as we meet more and more that this was not a legalistic kind of covenant as opposed to the gracious approach in the New Covenant, but this was a gracious constitution that God, the church is not a nation per se. Israel was the church is made up of many nations, individuals. Israel was a nation, and as a nation, they needed a constitution. They needed something to live by, right? The problem is over the centuries, the rabbis began to look at the Mosaic revelation more as a works righteousness thing, whereby you could obligate God to do something, and fail to see that this was really just a guidance for a people under God's grace. That's what it was. I mean, this goes all the way back. Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him for righteousness. So that's one thing. But this covenant didn't do. Oh yeah.
They didn't see that one verse is very explicit, and even the book of Levi, the Leviticus. How can they didn't see without the shedding of blood? There's no remission.
Well, remember, that went all the way up with the destruction of the temple. The reasoning goes, well, we can't offer blood sacrifices anymore. So obviously, the founder of Rabbinic Judaism today, Rabbi Zachai, Yochanan ben Zachai, founded the yeshiva at Yavna around 90 Common Era or AD, and he basically said that without the temple, they looked at all the texts in the Hebrew Bible that say that I don't want sacrifices, I want your heart attitude, and that's true. But God wanted both. But without the temple, they substituted blood sacrifice with the great three: prayer, repentance, and charitable deeds. And so that's what they say. And remember, they have authority from heaven. So think about that when you talk to your local rabbi. But anyway. Just saying. Anyway, I'm taking this class with these two secular rabbis, and so I have all these. I have to hold back, because no, and I don't mean that in a prideful way. I mean, these guys are smart guys, So you want to know your stuff.
I went to school with them, I know.
So now we have this thing that the Mosaic revelation. It's significant that God's historic kind of his revelation is manifested through a program of rescuing an enslaved people. I mean, this is and by the way, a lot of the mitzvot and the things that Jews do, not just on an annual basis, not just monthly, not just weekly, but daily, laying tefillin. If you look at the historic context in the Bible, it all goes back to the fact that we were slaves in Egypt. So this idea of being of the background of the Mosaic revelation being this grievous slavery is it's rooted in Jewish DNA. It's just part of it. So and this God's revelation was manifested through a program of rescuing a dispossessed slave people. So what does it say? Well, it just says right from the start. We don't have to get to the New Covenant. We can jump over to Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. We don't even have to go there. Even way back then, we see that God is a God who cares for the poor, he cares for the needy, he cares for the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the aged, the orphaned, the widowed, the defenseless. That's the kind of God we have, right? So God is our defender. Yeshua himself announces his ministry in these very terms, right? My gospel is going to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted. And if we go to Isaiah 11, we read, but with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. In any culture or society, that is the acid test for how a monarch or ruler, if he has a sensitivity to the poor and the defenseless, that becomes the acid test for his administration. So that's all I wanted to cover. That's as far as I want to go with the Mosaic revelation today. But I know it's. I don't like to go more than an hour or so. But if you could just give me a little bit of time, I want to just touch on one other thing for you. And I wrote a Hebrew word here, Sion, and I don't know. Here can check my Hebrew. Zion, the Hebrew word for Zion is Sion with a Sadi, a Yud, a Vav, and a Nun Sofit, or an ending Nun, right? And it kind of, if you're writing cursive, it kind of looks like this, right? So if I had my board, I would write a Sion, a Yud, a Vav, and an ending Nun. Right? That pretty good, Jeff? Yeah. So the Elfgrins are our checking. We have to check with them at all times. You know what's going on here. Okay, so let's just. I wanted to just touch on this word, if I can find it here. I had some things I wanted to share with you. Okay. Put this here. So how many here could tell me anything about the word Zion? We find the word Zion in the Bible a lot, right? Matter of fact, coming over here, I saw Zion Lutheran Church. Zion Lutheran Church, right? Yeah.
It's right by our house.
Yeah, you have one there, but there's another one. So so just to look briefly at this word Zion in the Hebrew Scriptures, I'm getting away from saying Old Testament because I'm taking this class and I don't say Old Testament. I say Hebrew Scriptures, right? Old Testament seems obsolete. That's all. The New Testament, that's the one, right? That's not what we want to hear. By the way, the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament has a lot more to say about the second coming than the New Testament. I'm telling you, believe me. You talk about paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph, even whole books.
Amen.
Because you can't separate the second coming of Yeshua with the battle over Jerusalem.
Nope.
They are one event. That's why it's very important for the church as we get closer to the second coming to rid themselves of this thing called replacement theology and understand that God makes unilateral, unconditional covenants. One of the big problems with replacement theologians is not only what I think is a faulty hermeneutic or method of interpreting the scriptures, not straightforwardly, right? No, I just see. This is what happens when you get in your closer to 70 than 60, right? This is what happens. I'll think of it. There was another reason why I felt that. But anyway, so I want to look at the word Zion in the Old Testament. The word Zion is connected to Jerusalem, and we'll close with this. Just this one section is connected to Jerusalem in the Bible and the future hope of Israel. But first, as this story begins to unfold, as you get through the Torah and you get into the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, we'll land in 2nd Samuel. Zion enters the kind of the scene, the biblical scene, as this little small mountain that David conquers. Does anybody know where that is? And if you don't, I don't blame you because I probably wouldn't know either. But if you have a Bible, if you just turn it to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, and you can just read that right there. That's the history. So again, looking at this word Sion or Zion in the Hebrew Bible, the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem are both referred to as Sion or Zion, and we first as we open the Bible and begin to read the story of a king and a kingdom and a coming kingdom, this we see in 2 Samuel chapter 5 that this kingdom is ultimately associated with a place. And does anybody want to read that real quick? Maybe that's the only verse we'll read here. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verses 6 through 8.
And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither. Thinking David cannot come in hither. Okay. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. The same is the city of David,
Okay, that's good. And I just want to, in this translation, now the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. And they said to David, "You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame shall turn you away," thinking David cannot come in here. In verse 7, nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. So the Jebusites were boasting that, hey, this place is so impregnable that, I mean, even if we were all blind and lame and dumb, we could still defend it. That's what they were boasting. And so David, of course, invades the Jebusites, and he establishes Zion. And Zion enters the Bible as this kind of little small mountain taken by David, and it subsequently becomes the city of David. Like either David names it the city of David, or it becomes. So Mount Zion in Jerusalem comes like to be eventually, because when you get to the, and this is all I want to do today, we'll end with this. It enters the Bible as this little insignificant mountain. It's just a place that David conquers. He takes it from the Jebusites, and he names it the city of David. But by the time we get to the Psalms, and then later to the prophets, there are these majestic descriptions of Zion that go far beyond what David would have understood, or maybe he did understand, but they go far beyond David's reign. And the glory of this place called Zion is a future that is set forth, and this becomes the hope, not just of Israel, but of the nations of the whole world, as the king, as David's greater son, it will ultimately rule from this place called Zion. So, all I wanted to do with this class, I just wanted to look up a couple of verses, maybe one or two more, and then we'll close. So we started out with this verse in 2 Samuel. We see that Zion is Jerusalem. It was this little mountain that David conquers. But if you look at some of these other passages, like if someone could just look up Psalm 132, even just for the sake of time, maybe I can just do it along with you, because I don't want to. I think we'll just end with this now. Yeah, Psalm 132, verse 11 through 13. If someone wants to look up Isaiah 51, verse 3, Zechariah 2, and 10 to 11, we'll just do that. There's so many. There's so many texts throughout the Hebrew Bible. Yeah. If you want to read that, David, just read that.
The Lord has sworn to David, the truth from which he will not turn back. Of the fruit of your body I will set upon your throne. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I will teach them, their sons also shall sit upon your throne forever. If the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his habitation.
Okay, so let's just one or two more. Does anybody want to look at how about Isaiah 62, verses 1 and 2? And then we'll have one more, and we'll close with that. Okay, read that one too. In the meantime, just read that one in the meantime. Then, yeah, Isaiah 62 verse 1 and 2. If you want to read the Zechariah 2 verses 10 and 11.
For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation as a blazing torch. Nations will sing your righteousness and all kingdoms and glory. You will be called by a new name, which I will do this name.
Good. You see, okay, so until her righteousness shines forth, remember, I will make you a great nation. Greatness and righteousness are married, right? God's not into making a wicked nation. So that is on God's to-do list, as our beloved spiritual father Don Finto would say. That is on God's to-do list. So I'm just trying to point out, when you get finally to the Psalms and the prophets, you find these majestic descriptions of Zion that go far beyond, David's time and David's reign. So one more. How about, do you have the Zechariah one? Yeah.
Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I am coming, and I will dwell in your midst, says the Lord. Many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and they shall become my people, and I will dwell in your midst. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you.
Okay, so again, Zion, and there's about 25 to 35 different references that I found. There's probably a lot more that each of these lifts up Zion as this majestic kind of description that really just go far beyond what David probably envisioned in his time. And here's the last statement I'll make. With the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and consequently the other civil war in 135 AD, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the fulfillment of Yeshua's words, not a single stone will be left upon another. And then the subsequent diaspora, where Jews now are dispersed throughout the entire world, this hope that is represented by Zion has taken on a universal aspect. In other words, it's shifted to heaven in a sense. Now, not all that is not bad, but the shift, with this shift, it began to move away from its physical moorings of Israel and that place where God's going to rule over the whole earth to this kind of like universal aspect. So you see today Mount Zion Lutheran Church, you see this Mount Zion Baptist Church, and it's taken on this universal, heavenly, ethereal kind of meaning, and has really been divorced from its moorings, when we read the text straightforwardly, because remember, what were the three criterion? What the author intended, what the audience would have understood within the historical framework of that day. And I don't have it with me, but I just want to show you one more thing before we leave here. Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, I just to show you here. Remember this one transparency. Remember we said with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, people began to really, maybe God really is through with the Jewish people. I mean, if you lived back then, if I lived back then, maybe I would have felt that way too. I mean, it was so horrific and so like impacting almost seemingly forever. I mean, this was the center, the heartthrob of Judaism, and it's destroyed, and Jews are banned and scattered to every corner of the earth. It looks like, so remember we said here the difference between promise and possession. And throughout Israel's history, this is a graph showing when they possessed more or less land. Remember, exile was a punishment, right? Exile was like the worst thing that could happen. God would exile you from your land, from that which is familiar. So we see in the times of Joshua and Judges, Israel begins to possess more and more of the land. And under the rule of David and Solomon, they possessed a lot, almost all of what God promised to them, but not quite. And then when the kingdom divides, remember the northern tribes go in the southern, then they possess less and less of the land until you finally get to 70 AD when they're just dispersed. So the problem, why I'm bringing this out, is this concept of promise versus possession. See, what theologians have done mistakenly, I think, is that they've associated promise with possession. So they say when Israel was not in possession of the land any longer, then the promise was nullified. But that's not true at all. That's not the case. Promise and possession are two different things. The fact that Israel is not in possession or has not been in possession of the land for the last 2,000 years didn't have anything to do with the promise. The promise was intact, and the promise will ultimately be seen. So next time we just get together, I just want to follow through with some of this word Zion, and why I think today there are certain events, a few events that have taken place in history that have really causing the church to think more and more about this word and its earthly moorings and what it means, and to recognize that Israel has a true election and a true call. And so we'll just close with that. Okay, so that's it. And you're welcome.